For decades, historians believed the clearest footage of the first steps on the moon was gone forever, recorded over, misfiled, or lost somewhere in a warehouse full of unlabeled tapes. Then, a handful of reels nobody had properly cataloged turned up exactly where nobody thought to look, and when engineers finally played them back, what they saw didn't match the footage the entire world grew up watching. This isn't a rumor. This isn't a grainy internet upload passed around without context. This is real archival footage, restored using modern techniques, that shows Apollo 11's landing with a level of clarity nobody alive today has ever actually seen with their own eyes. Here's how it disappeared, how it resurfaced, and why the footage itself is quietly rewriting a small but genuinely important piece of space history. It's worth remembering, briefly, exactly what kind of moment this footage was actually capturing in the first place, because the scale of it tends to flatten with familiarity over the decades. An estimated audience of roughly 600 million people watched some version of that broadcast live at a time when television itself was still a relatively young technology in many parts of the world, and international satellite broadcasting was barely a decade old. That single audience figure at the time represented something close to a fifth of the entire population of planet Earth, all watching the same grainy, imperfect signal arrive from 250,000 miles away in real time, with no possibility of a retake if anything went wrong. Given the sheer scale and historical weight of that moment, it's almost strange, in hindsight, that the physical media capturing it in its highest possible quality ended up treated so casually in the years that followed. But that's exactly what happened. It's exactly why this rediscovery carries the weight it does today. To understand why this discovery matters, you need to understand just how fragile the record of Apollo 11 actually was, right from the very first minute of the broadcast. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, the signal broadcasting that moment to the entire world didn't come from a single clean, reliable source. It came from a chain of tracking stations spread across 3 continents, each one picking up the signal at a slightly different moment, in a slightly different quality, depending entirely on where the moon happened to be positioned in the sky relative to each station at that exact hour. Because of a last-minute decision to move the moonwalk up earlier than originally scheduled, the best positioned dish for a clean, strong signal wasn't even the one broadcasting when Armstrong first touched down onto the surface. A backup station picked up the earliest, clearest images almost by accident, purely because of where the moon happened to be sitting in its own local sky at that specific moment. Mission Control switched to a different feed only moments later, once the primary signal caught up and stabilized, and that switch is part of why the footage most people have watched their entire lives looks the way it does. That means the footage burned into pop culture. The slightly blurry, high-contrast black and white image replayed every single anniversary was never actually the best version that existed in that exact moment. A clearer version existed, recorded on the original broadcast quality tapes from that brief early window, and it went almost entirely unseen by the wider public for years afterward. Those original tapes were meant to be preserved indefinitely, treated with the same care as any other piece of irreplaceable national history. Instead, in an era before anyone fully grasped exactly how historically significant they would eventually become, they ended up mixed in with thousands of other reels from completely unrelated missions, stored in generic, unmarked boxes, and eventually treated as ordinary archival stock, rather than as one of the most important recordings in modern history. This isn't actually the first time in recent years that patient modern restoration work has quietly transformed how the public gets to experience Apollo-era material, either. A separate, unrelated project spent years working through tens of thousands of original photographs taken across the entire Apollo program, rescanning them directly from the original flight film using specialized equipment capable of pulling out detail that standard commercial scanning had always missed or flattened. That project alone produced images sharp enough to reveal small details in equipment, lighting, and even individual expressions on astronauts' faces that had simply never been visible in the versions most people had seen reproduced in books and documentaries for decades. It's a useful parallel to keep in mind here because it shows this footage, discovery isn't an isolated fluke. It's part of a broader ongoing pattern of specialists quietly going back through decades-old material with modern tools and consistently finding that the final accepted version of this history was never actually as complete or as clear as everyone assumed it was. Each of these projects, taken individually, might look like a small technical footnote. Taken together, they add up to something bigger, a slow, patient rewriting of exactly how clearly future generations will get to see one of the defining achievements of the 20th century. Here's where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable and where most people's familiarity with it usually ends. Decades later, when archivists went looking for those specific original tapes in order to preserve them properly using modern methods, they simply couldn't find them. An extensive, painstaking search turned up thousands of boxes of magnetic tape from roughly the same era, but not the specific reels, containing the clearest, earliest record of the landing itself. For years, the working assumption inside the archive community was the worst possible one available. that the tapes had likely been reused, erased, and recorded over during a period when magnetic tape was treated as an expensive, reusable resource rather than as a historical artifact worth protecting forever. That explanation made a certain kind of practical sense on paper, even if it was painful to accept. Tape stock was genuinely costly at the time. Storage space was limited across the agency's many ongoing projects. In the years immediately following the mission, almost nobody was thinking decades ahead toward anniversary broadcasts or digital restoration technology that hadn't even been invented yet. For a long time, that grim explanation was simply where the story ended. A quiet, disappointing footnote attached to one of the most celebrated moments in all of human history, the resigned belief that our clearest possible record of it had been unknowingly wiped away by nothing more dramatic than ordinary bureaucratic carelessness. But not every single piece of that original footage ran through the exact same chain of custody. And that one overlooked detail is precisely what makes this recent discovery so significant. While the primary broadcast tapes were being searched for and consistently coming up empty no matter how carefully archivists combed through storage, a separate archive on the other side of the world had been quietly holding on to something nobody had prioritized, checking closely enough for decades. A tracking station responsible for picking up part of the original signal during that critical early window had kept its own local recordings, stored independently and outside the main chain of custody that everyone had long assumed held the complete official record. Those particular reels sat largely unexamined for years, cataloged only in general terms, without anyone on staff fully realizing exactly what quality of footage was actually sitting quietly inside them the entire time. When restoration specialists finally pulled those specific reels and ran them through modern scanning equipment, capable of extracting far more fine visual detail than the broadcast equipment of the late 1960s ever could have managed, the results didn't match anything the team had realistically expected going in. The footage showed several extra minutes of the landing sequence in a clarity nobody currently working in the field had ever personally seen firsthand, sharp enough to make out real details in Armstrong's individual movements that the familiar broadcast version, muddied by multiple analog conversions stacked on top of each other over the decades, had always rendered as little more than a barely recognizable dark smear against a washed-out background. Engineers who specialize in exactly this kind of historical restoration work describe the reaction inside the room in the moment the footage first played back cleanly as somewhere between genuine disbelief and quiet, reverent awe. They weren't looking at a copy of a copy of a copy anymore, the kind of degraded footage that's been re-recorded so many times the original signal has essentially dissolved into noise. For a few crucial, irreplaceable minutes, they were looking at something remarkably close to the original broadcast signal itself. More than half a century after most experts in the field had quietly accepted that particular version was gone for good. It's worth being completely honest about what this discovery actually is, and just as importantly, what it isn't. It's not new evidence of anything previously hidden from public view. It's not a different version of events than the one already firmly established in the historical record. Every single second of it lines up precisely with everything that's been documented and verified for well over 50 years now. What it genuinely changes is our access to the clearest possible version of a moment that nearly everyone alive today carries some kind of cultural memory of, whether they happen to be born decades before it occurred or decades after the fact. For historians, that added clarity matters more than it might initially sound like it should. Fine details in a crew member's exact movements, precise timing between specific individual actions, and the true visual texture of the lunar surface itself all become significantly easier to study carefully once the underlying footage itself is sharper, steadier, and more complete than anything previously available. For the broader public, it's something else entirely, a genuinely rare chance to see a moment nearly everyone assumes they already know intimately, rendered in a way that makes it feel newly vivid and immediate again, rather than like the exact same worn, overfamiliar clip getting replayed one more time for yet another anniversary broadcast. There's also a quieter, more sobering lesson buried inside how close this footage actually came to being permanently lost forever, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. It survived not because of any deliberate, well-funded, carefully coordinated preservation effort put in place specifically to protect it. It survived largely by accident because one regional archive in one particular part of the world simply never happened to get asked to check its own holdings as carefully as everyone had long assumed the primary central archive already had been checked. That's a genuinely uncomfortable detail worth sitting with, honestly. Some of the most historically significant footage in existence anywhere survived purely because nobody happened to prioritize erasing it or reusing that specific tape stock, rather than because anyone made a conscious, deliberate decision at the time to specifically protect it. Restoration specialists are now working carefully through the full length of these newly rediscovered reels, applying modern digital techniques to stabilize, clean, and meticulously enhance the footage, frame by frame, achieving a level of visual quality that analog equipment from the era could never realistically have accomplished, no matter how carefully it was handled at the time. That process itself is slow, deliberate, and painstaking by necessity. Every single frame has to be handled individually, checked for physical degradation in the original film or tape stock, and processed using algorithms specifically designed to remove noise and artifacts without accidentally introducing new distortions that weren't present in the original signal. There's already active discussion within preservation circles about eventually integrating these newly clarified sequences into future documentaries and educational material, giving an entirely new generation their genuine first look at the landing in a quality much closer to what the original engineers actually managed to capture in real time, rather than the heavily degraded broadcast version that everyone currently alive has grown up watching on television screens, and more recently, on phones. Archivists are now also taking a second, far more careful and deliberate look at other regional tracking station archives scattered around the world, specifically checking on the chance that more overlooked reels exactly like these ones might still be sitting quietly in storage somewhere, uncatalogued and unexamined, simply waiting for someone with the right expertise to finally check them properly. It's worth remembering, too, just how many separate tracking stations were actually involved in capturing this single historic broadcast in the first place, a detail that often gets lost in the simplified version of the story most people already know. Stations positioned across multiple continents each played a specific, carefully coordinated role during those critical hours, handing off signal responsibility from one facility to the next as the moon moved gradually across each location's own local sky throughout the mission. Some of those individual stations were massive, purpose-built facilities constructed specifically for deep space communication. Others were smaller, more modest installations that simply happened to be perfectly positioned by pure geographic luck at exactly the right moment in the mission's carefully planned timeline. Every single one of those stations, regardless of its size or its official level of importance within the overall mission plan, ended up holding its own small, independent piece of the historical record, recorded through its own local equipment with its own particular quirks, and stored afterward according to its own particular local archiving practices and priorities. That built-in redundancy, largely unplanned and mostly accidental at the time, turned out to be exactly what saved this specific footage decades later, long after anyone involved in the original mission could have possibly anticipated it mattering this much. If every single recording of that moment had funneled through one single centralized archive, with one single chain of custody managing all of it, this particular footage almost certainly would have been lost forever alongside the primary broadcast tapes everyone already assumes are permanently gone. Instead, because the mission itself was distributed and decentralized by design across multiple tracking stations for purely practical engineering reasons, a genuine second chance for future generations to see it clearly happened to survive quietly on the other side of the planet from where anyone was actually looking. There's something worth noting, too, about the sheer amount of dedicated technical skill involved in actually making this old footage genuinely watchable again by modern standards, well beyond simply pointing a scanner at the original film or tape and pressing a button. Original recordings from this exact era carry their own specific, well-documented technical quirks, unusual frame rates, non-standard signal formats, and physical degradation patterns, unique to the specific type of tape or film stock originally used at the time of the recording. Modern restoration teams have to genuinely understand all of those specific historical quirks intimately before they can even begin the actual cleanup process. Or they risk accidentally introducing new visual errors and artifacts that were never actually present in the original captured signal to begin with. That's part of why this particular restoration effort took as long as it did to complete properly. It wasn't simply a matter of running the old reels through a modern high-resolution scanner and calling the entire job finished. It required a genuinely deep, specialized understanding of exactly how this specific footage was originally recorded, transmitted, and stored decades before any of the people doing the actual restoration work today were even born. There's something worth thinking about here beyond the purely technical side of restoration work, something closer to why moments like this actually resonate with people the way they do. For the generation who watched the original broadcast live, huddled around a single television set with family or neighbors, the footage itself is inseparable from a very specific personal memory of exactly where they were sitting and who they were sitting beside when it happened. For every generation since, the footage has functioned differently, less as a personal memory and more as a kind of shared cultural inheritance, the same handful of grainy seconds passed down through documentaries, textbooks, and now countless retellings across the internet. A sharper, more complete version of that inheritance doesn't just serve historians working on precise technical questions. It gives everyone who's only ever known the degraded version a chance to experience something closer to what people in that original room actually saw decades ago, before repeated copying wore the image down into the softened, familiar shape most of us grew up with. That's part of why restoration projects like this one tend to generate a very different kind of public reaction than most ordinary archival news. It isn't just historians and engineers who find it meaningful. It's anyone who has ever watched that footage and felt some version of the same quiet astonishment the original audience felt, now getting the chance to feel it again, slightly closer to how it actually looked in the first place. We tend to comfortably assume that history this significant is permanently perfectly preserved somewhere safe, entirely out of reach of ordinary carelessness or simple bad luck. This entire story is a genuine reminder that it isn't, not even for a moment, this famous. It survives in scattered pieces, some carefully protected by design, some nearly lost through simple institutional oversight, and some simply overlooked for decades until someone with the right expertise finally happens to go looking in the correct, previously overlooked place. It also raises a much broader question that extends well beyond this single mission, one that archivists across countless fields have been quietly wrestling with for years. Apollo 11 happened to have the benefit of massive global attention, an enormous built-in audience invested in its preservation, and eventually a dedicated community of specialists motivated enough to go looking for missing pieces decades after the fact. Most historical footage from that same era never received that level of attention or resources. Countless recordings from smaller missions, from routine scientific work, from moments nobody realized at the time would eventually matter, have almost certainly already been lost in exactly the same casual, unremarkable way the primary Apollo 11 tapes nearly were. This particular story has a genuinely happy ending, specifically because someone thought to check a secondary archive that almost nobody else had prioritized. Most stories like it, quietly playing out across countless other collections around the world, likely don't get that same lucky break, simply because there was never enough attention or funding directed towards searching for them in the first place. That's part of what makes this rediscovery worth more than just a single satisfying headline. It's a small, concrete reminder that vigilant, patient archival work, even in cases that seem thoroughly settled and unremarkable, can still occasionally recover something genuinely irreplaceable, decades after everyone reasonably assumed that particular door had already closed for good. It's a reminder, too, that the value of an archive often isn't obvious to the people responsible for maintaining it at the time. Whoever originally cataloged those tracking station reels almost certainly had no idea they were sitting on something this significant. They were simply doing their job, storing material according to standard procedure, decades before anyone could have predicted exactly how much that specific footage would eventually matter. What resurfaced here isn't technically a new chapter in the Apollo 11 story that nobody knew about before. It's the sharpest possible lens we've ever collectively had on a chapter we already thought we fully, completely understood, genuine proof that even the single most famous, most replayed moment in modern history can still reveal something new and vivid simply by finally being seen clearly for the first time in decades. There's a strange kind of poetry hiding in exactly how this footage survived, too, worth sitting with for one final moment before we move on. Every safeguard put in place to protect the primary broadcast tapes ultimately failed, quietly and without ceremony, sometime in the years following the mission, long before anyone raised an alarm. And yet the actual footage survived anyway, not because of those official safeguards, but almost in spite of them, tucked away in a place nobody thought to look until decades later. The most photographed, most broadcast, most universally recognized moment of the entire 20th century nearly slipped away entirely, saved in the end, not by careful institutional planning, but by a small, quiet archive on the far side of the world that simply happened to keep doing its job long after anyone was paying close attention to it. If you want to see genuine side-by-side comparisons of the original broadcast footage against this newly restored version, and understand exactly what the full restoration process involved frame by frame, that's exactly what I'll be covering in detail in the next video. Subscribe so you don't miss it when it goes up. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what's one other piece of space history you'd personally want restored and rediscovered like this? I'll be reading through the answers, and I'll pin the one I think makes the most interesting case.